He didn't speak at the altar. He simply looked at me like I already belonged to someone else. The church was too bright, too quiet in the way that made every breath feel exposed. I stood in a white dress that never felt like mine, my fingers locked together so tightly they ached, while everyone around me smiled, as if happiness could be forced into existence. I kept telling myself to stay still, to get through it, to survive the moment like I had survived everything else in my life. But then I felt it, a shift in the air, subtle at first, like the room itself had decided to hold its breath. The doors at the back of the church opened without ceremony, and every head turned at once. He walked in like he had never been told no in his life. Dark suit, calm steps, eyes that didn't search the room because they already knew exactly what they would find. I didn't know him, not in any real sense, but something about him made my chest tighten as if my body recognized danger before my mind could catch up. The man I was supposed to marry reached for my hand, confused, but even his grip felt uncertain now. The stranger stopped halfway down the aisle, his gaze locked on me with a stillness that erased every sound in the room. No one spoke. No one moved. It felt like the world had narrowed to a single point between us. Then he said it, not loudly, not angrily, just with quiet certainty that made it worse. Wrong bride. A ripple went through the guests, confusion breaking the illusion of celebration. My breath caught because I knew, somehow, instinctively, that he wasn't talking to them. He was talking about me. I took a small step back without meaning to, my dress brushing against the polished floor, my heart beating too fast to count properly. The man beside me tried to speak, to demand answers, but the stranger raised a hand slightly, and the entire room seemed to obey the silence. Then he walked closer, and I realized no one was going to stop him, not because they couldn't, but because they wouldn't. There was something about him that made resistance feel pointless, not through force, but through certainty. He stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could see the calm in his expression, too controlled to be accidental. His voice lowered, softer now, almost thoughtful, as if he were correcting a detail only he could see. But perfect. My throat went dry because I didn't understand how both things could be true at once. Wrong bride. But perfect. My name wasn't spoken, yet I felt seen in a way that made me want to step backward and forward at the same time. The church doors opened again behind him, and this time I heard movement, quiet, organized, deliberate. People in dark suits entered without urgency, their presence shifting the entire atmosphere without a single raised voice. Someone near me gasped, someone else stood, but it all felt distant, like I was underwater watching a world I no longer belonged to. I turned slightly, searching for explanation, for logic, for anything that could make this make sense. But when I looked back at him, he only held my gaze like the answer had already been decided long before I ever walked into this church. "You're coming with me," he said, not as a question, not as a threat, but as if it were simply the next unavoidable step in something already in motion. And in that moment, standing between a life I was supposed to have and a stranger who spoke like fate itself, I realized nothing about today had ever been under my control. The silence that followed his words felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced, like the air itself had thickened around my lungs and refused to let me breathe properly. I could feel every eye in the room pressing into me, waiting for me to react, to cry, to run, to do something that would make sense of what was happening, but my body did not obey any of those expectations. I stood there frozen, my fingers still trembling slightly against the fabric of a dress that suddenly felt like part of someone else's life. He did not rush me. He did not repeat himself. He simply waited, as if time itself was something he could afford to waste. The man who was supposed to stand beside me tried to speak again, his voice cracking with confusion and rising panic, but no one listened to him. Not even me. My attention kept pulling back to the stranger in front of me, the one who had walked into my life like a decision already made. When I finally managed to speak, my voice came out quieter than I expected, fragile and uncertain, asking the only question my mind could form. "Who are you?" For a moment, he did not answer. His eyes held mine with a patience that felt almost unsettling, as if he was deciding how much truth I was ready to survive. Then he took a small step closer, just enough that the world around us faded further into something irrelevant and distant. "Dominic Hale," he said calmly. like the name alone should explain everything. It did not. But something in the way people around us reacted told me it was not a name that needed explanation in their world. I noticed movement at the edges of the church, people shifting, whispering, stepping back as if the space itself had changed ownership. The man I was supposed to marry let go of my hand without realizing it. His expression caught between disbelief and helplessness. No one stopped Dominic when he turned slightly and gestured once, subtle and controlled, toward the aisle. The doors at the back opened further, and the people who had entered earlier remained still, positioned with quiet precision that made me realize this was not chaos. It was structure. It was control. My pulse quickened as I realized I was standing in the center of something I did not understand, something far larger than a wedding, far larger than me. I took a step back instinctively, my heels catching slightly on the polished floor, but one of the suited men shifted just enough to block the exit without touching me. No one spoke. There were no raised voices, no visible threats, only presence and certainty filling every corner of the room. Dominic's attention returned to me, and when he spoke again, his tone had softened slightly, though it carried the same undeniable weight. "You are not supposed to be here," he said, as if correcting a mistake in a document only he could see clearly. My throat tightened because I did not understand how I could be in the wrong place in my own life. "Then let me leave," I said, the words coming out more firmly this time, though they still carried a trace of fear I could not hide. For the first time, something shifted in his expression, not anger, not surprise, but something closer to recognition. As if my answer was not unexpected, but still important. He studied me for a long moment, his gaze steady, unflinching, as if he were reading something beneath my words that I could not see. Then, finally, he spoke again, quieter than before. "You do not leave until I understand why you exist in the wrong place." And with that, I realized this was not an interruption anymore. It was the beginning of something I could no longer step away from. The words he spoke did not leave my mind, even as the room around me began to shift into something unfamiliar and controlled, as if reality itself had quietly changed its rules the moment he finished talking. I could still hear the faint echoes of confusion behind me, the broken rhythm of a ceremony that no longer felt like it belonged to anyone in that room. My hands were still trembling, but I forced myself to lower them, to hide the weakness I could feel growing in my chest. Dominic did not move closer again. Instead, he simply turned slightly, as if giving silent instruction to the world around him. That small motion was enough for the people in suits to reposition themselves without a word, creating invisible boundaries that I suddenly understood I was not meant to cross. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, forcing myself to focus on something logical, something real, something that could anchor me to what was happening. "You are making a mistake," I said, though my voice lacked the strength I wanted it to carry. He looked back at me immediately, as if he had been waiting for me to say exactly that. "I do not make mistakes," he replied calmly, not in arrogance, but in absolute certainty, the kind that did not invite argument. That answer unsettled me more than anything else so far. It was not a threat, not an emotional reaction, just a statement of fact from someone who clearly believed it. My chest tightened as I realized no one in the room was going to intervene. Not the guests, not the staff, not even the man I was supposed to marry, who now stood frozen near the altar, as if unsure whether he still had a place in the moment unfolding in front of him. I took another step back, slower this time, testing whether the space behind me still belonged to me. But the subtle shift of one of the suited men made it clear that my movement was being observed without needing to be stopped. Dominic noticed everything. His gaze followed me with quiet precision, not like someone chasing, but like someone measuring distance. "You were not part of this arrangement," he said after a moment, his tone lower now, almost reflective. I frowned slightly, trying to understand what he meant. "I do not know you," I answered, my voice more controlled now, though still shaken. For the first time, something faintly changed in his expression, not disbelief, but calculation, as if my answer was a piece of information that complicated something already in motion. He stepped forward just enough that I instinctively stopped moving back. The space between us narrowed, not physically forced, but undeniably controlled. "That is exactly the problem," he said quietly. I felt my breath catch because nothing about this situation made sense in any normal way, yet everything around me suggested that normal no longer applied. I glanced toward the doors again, calculating distance, escape, possibility, but every angle seemed accounted for without anyone needing to say a single word. Dominic's attention shifted briefly toward the altar, then back to me, as if confirming something only he could verify. Someone placed you here, he continued, more to himself than to me. Or you were moved into position without knowing it. My confusion deepened into unease because I had no idea what he was talking about, and yet the certainty in his voice made it impossible to dismiss entirely. I shook my head slightly, forcing myself to stay grounded. I am not a part of anything like that, I said firmly, though even I could hear the uncertainty beneath it. He studied me again, longer this time, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something like restraint in his eyes, as if he was deciding how much truth to reveal. Then he spoke again, and his voice carried a finality that ended the argument before it could even begin. You are now. The moment he said those words, something in the air changed again, not louder, not sharper, but deeper, like the ground beneath everything I knew had quietly shifted without permission. I stood still, trying to process what he meant, but every explanation I reached for dissolved before it could fully form. Around us, the church no longer felt like a place of ceremony. It felt like a structure being quietly repurposed for something else, something I was not included in, but somehow placed at the center of. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, steady but heavy, as if my body understood the seriousness before my mind could translate it. Dominic remained calm, his attention steady on me, not impatient, not emotional, just present in a way that made it impossible to ignore him. You do not need to understand it yet, he said finally, his voice measured, as if he was speaking about something inevitable rather than optional. I shook my head slightly, refusing to accept something I had not agreed to, something I had not even been informed about. I am not part of anything, I said again, this time more firmly, trying to anchor myself in the only truth I could still control, which was my own refusal. For a brief moment, his gaze softened, not in sympathy, but in recognition, as if he had expected that response from someone who had not yet seen enough of the world he moved in. You were placed here before you ever walked into this building, he replied quietly. The words did not make sense at first, and that confusion gave me a fragile sense of control, but it did not last. I turned my head slightly, scanning the room again, noticing details I had ignored before, the way certain guests were no longer pretending to celebrate, the way certain exits were no longer treated as exits, the way time itself felt paused in anticipation of something unspoken. My mind tried to rationalize it as coincidence, misunderstanding, mistake, anything ordinary enough to survive in, but nothing about the moment felt ordinary anymore. Dominic took one step closer, not enough to intimidate, but enough to ensure I could not pretend. Distance would solve anything. Someone connected you to this moment, he continued, his tone steady, almost analytical, which means you were already part of the equation before I arrived. I exhaled slowly, frustration mixing with fear because I hated how easily he spoke in certainty while I was still trapped in confusion. I do not know what you are talking about, I said, my voice quieter now, less defiant, more strained. He studied me again, and I felt something in that silence, not pressure, but assessment, as if I were a variable he had not fully accounted for yet. Then he turned his head slightly toward one of the men near the aisle, a subtle gesture that caused immediate movement without explanation. I noticed it then, the coordination, the precision, the absence of hesitation in anyone around him. It was not chaos. It was structure, and I was not inside it. I took a careful breath, forcing myself to focus on the only thing I still recognized as real, my own name, my own past, my own life before this moment. But even those thoughts felt distant now, like they belonged to someone standing slightly outside of me. Dominic's voice brought me back, lower now, almost final. You will understand soon enough, he said. And for the first time since he walked into my life, I realized the most unsettling part was not what he was doing to me, but how certain he was that I was already part of it. For a moment after he finished speaking, I stopped trying to argue because I realized that every attempt to fight for control was slipping further away from me, not because I had agreed to anything, but because nothing around me was reacting to my resistance the way it should have. The church still looked like a church, but it no longer behaved like one. Conversations had faded into controlled silence, movements reduced to subtle repositioning, and every person present seemed to understand an order of reality that I was not part of. I felt my fingers curl slightly at my sides, not in anger now, but in an effort to stay grounded in something physical, something real. Dominic had not moved far, but he no longer needed to. His presence alone was enough to hold the space between us in a way that felt deliberate, as if distance was no longer measured in steps, but in authority. I looked at him again, searching for any sign of uncertainty, any fracture in the calm certainty he carried, but there was none. He was not reacting to the situation. He was managing it. That distinction made my chest tighten more than anything else so far. "If I am not supposed to be here," I said carefully, choosing each word as if it might matter more than I understood, "then why am I still standing in front of you?" For the first time, his gaze shifted slightly, not away from me, but deeper into thought, as if my question had reached something beneath his surface control. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step to the side, his eyes briefly scanning the room again, not in confusion, but in calculation, like someone verifying a detail in a plan that was already in motion long before I arrived. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of explanation and replaced with something closer to certainty. "Because removing you now would create more instability than keeping you here," he said. The words made no emotional sense, but they carried a logic that I could not ignore. I frowned slightly, trying to translate what he meant into anything I could understand. "Instability in what?" I asked, my voice barely steady now. He looked back at me immediately, and for the first time there was something almost faintly human in his expression, not softness, but awareness of how far apart our realities were. "In everything that was already arranged before you stepped inside this building," he replied. My breath caught again, because the way he said it made it sound less like an event and more like a system, something structured and already in motion. I shook my head slightly, not in denial of him anymore, but in refusal to accept how easily he was placing me inside something I had never been told about. "I was invited to a wedding," I said, trying to anchor myself to the only fact I could still hold. "That is all." His eyes held mine for a long moment, and then he spoke again, slower this time, as if choosing honesty over simplicity. "You were invited into a role," he said, "not a celebration." The distinction hit harder than I expected because it stripped away the last remaining illusion of normality. Around us, I noticed movement again, subtle but coordinated, as if the environment itself was responding to shifts I could not fully perceive. Dominic did not look away from me while it happened, and that made it worse, because it meant none of this required his attention to function. I took a small breath, forcing myself to remain steady even as confusion and fear tightened inside me. "I do not want any role," I said quietly, though the certainty in my voice was weakening. For the first time since he arrived, something in his expression softened slightly, not in sympathy, but in recognition of resistance he had already expected. "That decision was not available to you," he said calmly. And in that moment, I understood that whatever this was, it was not beginning now. It had already begun without me. The moment he stopped speaking, I realized the silence between us was no longer empty. It was structured, as if even quiet had been arranged in advance to hold me in place while I tried to understand what was happening. I could still hear faint movement in the distance, subtle shifts of people who no longer felt like guests at a wedding, but like participants in something far more controlled, yet none of it felt relevant to my immediate reality anymore. My focus kept returning to Dominic, because he was the only constant in a space that no longer behaved like anything I recognized. I pressed my fingers lightly into my palm, grounding myself in physical sensation, trying to stay present as my thoughts spiraled through confusion, disbelief, and a growing sense that resistance was no longer about defiance, but about survival of understanding. Dominic observed me quietly for a moment longer, then turned slightly and made a small gesture toward one of the men near the side of the aisle. Immediately, without explanation, the man moved forward and then stopped a few feet away, not blocking me, not touching me, simply creating a boundary that felt invisible but absolute. I did not like how. Naturally, I understood that boundary, as if my instincts were adapting faster than my reasoning. "You are overwhelmed," Dominic said finally, not as an accusation, but as a statement of observation. I looked at him sharply, because hearing it spoken out loud made it harder to hide. I am trying to understand what is happening, I replied, my voice quieter now, less steady than before. He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something predictable, then shifted his attention briefly toward the side doors of the church before returning his focus to me. Understanding will come after you are no longer in the center of it, he said. I frowned, because nothing about that made sense to me. Then move me out of it, I said immediately, the words slipping out faster than I intended, carrying more urgency than I wanted to admit. For the first time, he did not respond right away. Instead, he studied me again, and I noticed something different in his expression, not hesitation, but evaluation that felt more personal than before. That is not possible here, he said calmly. Before I could respond, one of the suited men stepped forward again, this time holding a small glass of water, offering it without speaking. I hesitated, then accepted it slowly, because my throat felt too tight to ignore. The moment I took it, Dominic's gaze lowered briefly, then returned to my face. You are not in danger from me, he added, his tone steady but deliberate, as if he knew that needed to be said before anything else could be believed. I stared at him, searching for any contradiction in his expression, any sign that would allow me to dismiss him as simply another powerful man demanding control. But what unsettled me most was the absence of emotional volatility. There was no anger, no persuasion, no urgency, only certainty. Then why am I being held here? I asked quietly, though even the word held felt wrong, because nothing physical restrained me, and yet I could not find a clear path to leave. Dominic turned his head slightly again, as if acknowledging something beyond my line of sight, then answered in a lower voice. Because what is outside this building is not structured to protect you, he said. My grip on the glass tightened slightly. Protect me from what? I asked, though I was not sure I wanted the answer. He looked back at me, and for the first time, there was a faint shift in tone, not softer, but more precise. From the reason you were placed here, he said. And in that moment, I understood that whatever this was, it was no longer about a wedding, or a mistake, or even me being in the wrong place. It was about something already moving long before I ever walked down that aisle. For a long moment after he spoke, I could not tell if the world had become quieter or if my mind had simply stopped processing everything happening around me. The words still lingered in the air, heavy and unshakable, as if they had weight beyond meaning, as if they were not meant to be questioned but simply absorbed. I held the glass of water in my hands without drinking, because even that small action felt like a decision I was not ready to make. Dominic stood at the same distance, not approaching, not retreating, simply existing in a position that made it clear he was not waiting for permission to remain. I felt my pulse slow slightly, not from calm, but from the strange realization that panic alone would not help me understand anything here. My eyes moved briefly across the room again, and I noticed something I had not seen before, not changes in people, but changes in attention. It was subtle, almost invisible, the way certain figures no longer looked at the ceremony, but occasionally at me, as if I had become the focal point of something they already understood. That realization made my stomach tighten, because it suggested this was not an isolated decision made by one man, but something wider, something I had walked into without knowing the shape of it. I turned my attention back to Dominic, forcing myself to speak even though my voice felt distant in my own ears. If I am not in danger from you, I said carefully, then what exactly am I in danger from? For the first time, he did not answer immediately, and that silence felt different, less controlled, more reflective, as if the question had reached something he did not dismiss as easily as the others. He looked past me briefly, toward the far end of the church, then back again, as though weighing what could be said without breaking something larger. You are asking the wrong direction of the question, he said finally. I frowned slightly, confusion rising again because I was still trying to anchor everything in logic I understood. Then what is the right question? I asked. He studied me for a moment longer, and I noticed the faintest shift in his posture, not tension, but attention sharpening. The right question, he said quietly, is why someone placed you where I would find you. The words settled in my chest in a way that felt heavier than anything before, because it removed even the illusion that this was random. I shook my head slightly, not out of denial anymore, but because my mind was struggling to hold all of it at once. I did not choose any of this, I said, my voice lower now, almost breaking under its own weight. Dominic nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something he already knew. I am aware, he replied. The simplicity of that answer unsettled me more than any explanation could have, because it suggested that my lack of choice was already accounted for in whatever structure this was. I took a careful breath, trying to steady myself, then asked the only thing I could still grasp. Then why me? My voice came out quieter than I expected, stripped of certainty, because I no longer felt certain about anything. Dominic looked at me for a long moment, and for the first time, there was something almost distant in his expression, not emotional distance, but the kind that came from seeing patterns rather than people. That, he said slowly, is what I intend to understand before this continues any further. And in that moment, I realized the most unsettling part was not that I had been pulled into something unknown, but that even the man who had taken control of the situation did not fully know why I mattered within it. The words he had just spoken did not leave the space between us. They stayed there, suspended, as if the air itself refused to let them fall away. I stood still, holding the glass without drinking, because every instinct I had told me that if I moved too quickly, I would lose whatever fragile sense of control I still had over my own mind. The church no longer felt like a place of celebration or confusion. It felt like a room where answers were being delayed on purpose, as if truth itself was being negotiated in silence. Dominic had not changed his position, but something in his expression had shifted, not toward me, but inward, as if he was now thinking in directions I could not follow. I watched him carefully, searching for something human to anchor myself to, but what unsettled me most was how calm he remained, while everything around me felt unstable. You said you want to understand why I matter, I said finally, my voice quieter than before, no longer demanding, only searching. He looked at me immediately, as if that question had been waiting for him. Yes, he replied simply. I hesitated, because part of me wanted to reject the idea entirely, to insist that I did not matter in any system beyond my own life. But that belief was beginning to feel less certain with every passing moment. Then what happens to me while you are trying to understand that? I asked, because that was the only question that still felt real enough to hold on to. Dominic paused, and for the first time since this began, I saw something like measured restraint in his expression, not uncertainty, but awareness of consequences that were not mine to understand yet. You remain where I can ensure nothing interferes with that process, he said. The answer should have sounded like control, but instead it sounded like containment of something neither of us fully understood. I looked away for a moment, letting my eyes drift across the church again, and this time I noticed more detail than before, not just people watching, but patterns in how they watched. Some looked at me briefly, then away, as if confirming recognition, while others avoided me completely, as if my presence required discipline rather than curiosity. I felt a strange tension building in my chest, not panic, but awareness that I was being measured in ways I had never agreed to. When I looked back at Dominic, I noticed his attention had followed my glance, as if he was tracking not just me, but my perception of the room itself. You are noticing it now, he said quietly. I frowned slightly. Noticing what? I asked. He did not answer immediately, and that delay made the space between us feel even more precise. Then he spoke, his voice lower than before. That you are not being reacted to like someone unknown. The statement made something in my thoughts shift, because it suggested familiarity without explanation, recognition without introduction. That does not make sense, I said immediately, because it was the only logical response I could still rely on. Dominic nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the contradiction without denying it. It does not need to make sense yet, he replied. I felt my grip tighten slightly around the glass again, not from fear alone now, but from the growing realization that the lack of explanation was intentional, not accidental. I took a careful breath, steadying myself, and said the only thing I could still say with honesty. I do not like not knowing what I am part of. For the first time, something almost imperceptible softened in his gaze, not in emotion, but in recognition of something he understood too well. Neither do I, he said quietly. And in that moment, I understood that whatever this was, it was not only happening to me. It was something even he had not fully stepped outside of. The silence that followed felt different from all the ones before it, not heavier or lighter, but more final in a way I could not immediately explain, as if something had reached a point of decision without anyone announcing it out loud. I stood where I was, still holding the glass, though I no longer remembered whether I had taken a sip or not, because my attention was fully locked on Dominic and the way his expression had subtly changed. He was no longer simply observing me. There was something behind his calm now, something more focused, as if a conclusion was forming in real time, and even he was adjusting to it. I noticed his eyes shift once toward the side of the church, then back to me, and for the first time, I felt like I was not the only one being evaluated by the situation. "You are thinking too much," he said quietly, though his tone was not dismissive. I shook my head slightly, because that was not true. I was thinking too little, trying to hold together pieces that refused to align. "I am trying to understand what is happening to me," I replied, my voice softer now, no longer resisting, only searching. He studied me for a moment longer, and then something changed in his posture, subtle but unmistakable, like a decision had been made without movement. "It is not just happening to you," he said. The words landed differently this time, because they no longer placed me at the center of something unknown, but inside a connection I had not yet been shown. I frowned slightly. "Then what is it?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "If it is not just about me?" For a long moment, he did not answer, and in that pause I felt something shift again in the room, not physically, but in attention, as if invisible lines had been redrawn. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more precise than before. "It is about convergence," he said. I did not understand the word in the way he intended it, and I could see that he knew I would not. "Convergence of what?" I asked, though I was no longer sure I wanted the answer. He stepped slightly closer this time, not invading space, but reducing distance until the air between us felt intentional rather than accidental. "Of paths that were not supposed to cross without consequence," he said. I felt my breath catch, because that sentence carried weight I could not measure yet. My mind searched for something logical, something ordinary to attach it to, but nothing about this felt ordinary anymore. I looked past him briefly, noticing the stillness of the people around us again, the way everything seemed paused in anticipation rather than confusion. Then I looked back at him. "And what happens now?" I asked, because I needed something tangible, something that existed in time rather than theory. Dominic held my gaze for a long moment, and I saw it clearly now, not uncertainty, not control, but awareness that the answer was no longer simple for either of us. "Now," he said quietly, "we stop assuming this began when you walked into that church." My chest tightened slightly because I understood, without fully understanding, that whatever this was, it had started long before I ever realized I was part of it, and ending it was no longer a matter of choice, but of discovering what had already been set in motion.